Okay, once again, this is the Certified Domestic Abuse Advocate training on mental health issues, substance abuse, trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, and Stockholm Syndrome. I'm going to start with the PTSD stuff first, and then we'll talk about what that might mean as far as implications within your program. If you want to talk, you can click the raise your hand button. I'll make sure you're unmuted on my end. You have to unmute yourself on your end too. If you're on a phone, *6 mutes you, *6 again unmutes you. It's a toggle. I'm recording this so that it will be available later for people to review. And I think that's about it. You can also communicate by typing in the question box in your control panel. As far as written materials to go along with this, if you go to ICADVA's website, which looks like this, under the Resource tab, you'll see Resource Library. If you click on that, the first thing listed there is Training Manuals for Advocates. Now, these training manuals are essentially going to be the same. We just finished changing the certification program a little bit, but the initial, what was the level 1 training, all of that still applies. Same thing for the level 2 training. If you scroll down a little bit, the Certified Domestic Abuse Advocate, that's all there is going to be. There's going to be level 1, level 2, level 3. All of those topics apply. We'll be adding a few extra ones that have not been covered in the past, and maybe just do a little renumbering, reformatting, but the information remains current and is still what we're going to be using. So what we're going to be looking at today is this section 3, the post-traumatic stress disorder and Stockholm Syndrome section, and then section 6, mental health and substance abuse issues. So if you feel like you've missed out on something or you want to go back and review something I said, that's another place you can get it. Also, I know I learn best if I actually have to read stuff too. So if you are one of those visual learners, download those, read them, and I think that'll help a lot. Okay. Well, moving right along then and getting started. The first thing I want to give you an image of when we talk about trauma, the first thing to think about is this thing that is sometimes referred to as self-capacity in the trauma literature. And that term is actually pretty self-explanatory. It's your ability, your capacity to maintain your sense of self, of who you are. It's your map of who am I, how do I relate to other people, what is my position in the world, what does the world look like, how does the world function. Everything about your sense of self is part of your self-capacity. It's your ability to soothe yourself. So if something bad happens, what are the messages that you tell yourself? Do you say, well, no wonder this happened because I'm such a loser? Or do you say, well, yep, it was a bad day, I learned something the hard way, tomorrow will be better, I can try it again tomorrow, things aren't so bad. All of that leads into my ability to maintain who I am and who I am in the world. My value system, my self-esteem is absolutely a part of that. And also my ability to get my needs met. So my ability to access the external resources I might need to maintain myself. Do I have good help-seeking skills? When I'm in trouble, do I have the ability to ask people for what I need? Are there people to even ask? Do I have those relationship skills where I have some kind of a safety net and support system? All of those things allow me to maintain a self. So that is my self-capacity. So if you think about a scale, on one side of you is your self-capacity, and on the other side is the level of trauma that you have experienced. Now those two things have to at least stay in some kind of balance. If they don't, you're going to be in trouble. If your trauma is greater than your ability to maintain yourself, then your self will actually begin to break down. You might have all kinds of various trauma symptoms. You might, in the end, if you have tremendous trauma, you might actually have a psychotic break. And Jody, I see you have a question. I've unmuted you if you want to talk to us all. Yes? No? I'll leave you on unmute for a while, and you or try to figure out how to get your microphone to work. Okay. If any of you have seen the movie The Fisher King, it's a great example of where somebody's trauma outweighs their self-capacity. I highly recommend it as a movie about trauma. In that movie, Robin Williams is one of the main characters, and what you learn through the course of the movie, and hopefully I'm not blowing the plot for everybody, is that he used to be an English literature professor. And then one day he's sitting in a cafe with his wife, and this man comes in armed with a shotgun and starts killing people randomly and shoots Robin Williams' wife in the head. And so he sees this horrible tragedy, and at that point, basically, he loses it. He has a psychotic episode, and through the bulk of the movie, what he is now is this street person who is looking for the Holy Grail to heal himself, and being chased by this very frightening red knight that represents the trauma that happened to him. And he has no real memory except in little bits and pieces and flashes and very scary images of his former life and who he was. So I, as I said, really recommend that as a case study in how severe trauma can impact people. And that's something to think about. The more severe the injury somebody has experienced, the more severe the trauma, the more severe the solution. So in that movie, we see an incredibly severe solution. Robin Williams, his self-capacity was completely overwhelmed. He couldn't be that person anymore, and he ended up as somebody entirely different, with no recall, no access to his former life or what had happened to him, because it was just too much to bear. Really, it was too much to bear. So the more severe the injury somebody's experienced, the more severe the solution that their mind will come up with to keep them alive. And the movie title again is The Fisher King. Okay, there we go. I'll send it out in text too. The Fisher King, which is a reference to an Arthurian legend, one of the legends in the whole King Arthur King Arthur series, not trauma, whole King Arthur series. Alrighty. So if there's more trauma than self-capacity, the person will break down. And what you're going to see as far as ways they try and keep that balance going, one is to dissociate. Now, you're probably familiar with the idea of dissociation, where people just kind of are no longer in their body or no longer fully present with you. And that is really an ability like musical talent. Some people are born with an innate ability to dissociate easily and well, and other people don't have it so much. However, there are lots of things out there, chemicals, for example, alcohol, many substances that can help you dissociate if you need a little help with that. So people may have an innate ability to dissociate. They can numb out in lots of different ways, including through substance abuse. So if I'm not in contact, if I'm not aware of the trauma I've experienced, then I can live with it. Another way of dealing with the trauma and trying to keep those two in balance is classified as tension reduction activities. And some examples are, when kids when kids are experiencing a lot of stimulus, they tend to act out. Kids are in motion if they're really excited, and kids can often be in motion when they're really sad or scared. So acting out is something that kids often do to reduce the amount of tension. When you're tense, you might have your leg that bobs. You might pick at your fingernails. You might twirl your hair. There are probably lots of little fidgety things that you do with your body which are about reducing tension, as well as other behaviors. Again, drinking, eating. I always say that there's nothing out there that Haagen-Dazs won't cure. And that comfort food eating is absolutely a tension reduction activity for me. People may engage in compulsive shopping, compulsive gambling, compulsive sexual activity, all kinds of things that are about reducing the amount of tension that they're experiencing to try and keep the balance. A third category of strategies for keeping the balance is classified as distraction or avoidance. In other words, this is going on, but I'm going to keep my attention focused elsewhere. You probably have experienced a client or a coworker or a friend who it seems like wherever they go and whatever they're doing, chaos seems to follow in their wake. They are the pot stirrers. So if there's any conflict, interpersonal conflict, they're the person in there stirring it up and making matters worse. That's a distraction technique. In other words, as long as my life is in chaos and there's all this stuff going on outside, I don't have to focus on the pain that I'm experiencing within. I'm distracted from it. Some folks might put themselves in dangerous situations, kind of going the extreme opposite way, intellectualizing, and well, it doesn't affect me at all, and I can give you a long theory about PTSD and blah, 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 without ever having to actually acknowledge the internal pain I'm actually experiencing. So those are just a couple, those are kind of the way that strategies are categorized, and if you think about things that you've seen traumatized people doing, I think you'll find they probably fit into one of these. Again, they're just trying to keep that balance because they don't want to lose themselves. So if you have somebody who is doing some of those behaviors and you're scared for them, they're drinking, they're using drugs, they're cutting themselves, and you say, nope, you can't do that anymore. Let's say you have somebody come into your program and they're a cutter. They've got razor blade marks up and down their arms, and you say, we don't allow that here. That's not a safe behavior. While you're with our program, you can't do that. Any ideas what those folks are going to do? Anybody want to send me in the little question box some answers? You tell them don't do that. How are they going to respond to you? That's my clue to get a drink too. Or unmute yourself and answer. Leave? Yeah. Carissa says that they will leave. Absolutely. There's a real good chance they'll just say, screw you, and end up out of your program. They're more likely that they won't come back to your services. And let me just copy this answer to everybody. Sherry says they're more likely not that they won't come back to your service, and this is the only thing that they can control. Absolutely. They'll feel misunderstood, that what you're doing is making their situation harder. Linda says that they will possibly suffer even more of a break or become suicidal. Yes, because you're removing their one coping skill. So think about somebody who is hanging off a cliff, right? And there's this tree limb sticking out, and they're hanging on to that for dear life, and that tree limb is the cutting or the drugs or whatever else, and you come in and you say, oh, don't worry, I'm an advocate, I am a crisis professional, I will save you, and their answer is, screw you, I'm not letting go. And that should be their answer. That is smart for that to be their answer, because they cannot trust that you are down there with a safety net for them. And so what I would suggest to you is that we have to find ways to put the safety net under their feet first before they're going to be willing to let go, just like you would do in the same situation. Like, I'm not letting go and hoping the firemen get here in time to catch me on the little trampoline thing. You better have them down there with the trampoline first, and then you can convince me to let go. Sherry also adds that self-injury, people that here I'm going to copy stuff out, that people who self-injure may have difficulty making personal connections with other people, and again, that's part of this whole trauma reaction. When I have connected to other people, I have been hurt, and so I withdraw from other people to protect myself, and then you've got the kind of the cyclical thing, and then my ability to access resources is damaged. That leads into it damages my self-capacity even further. Okay, so let's set that little model of the scales aside for just a moment, and I want to talk about what happens in somebody's physical body when they are facing a traumatic experience. You all are probably familiar with the idea of the fight or flight response. And one thing I want to add is that there's actually 3, and I need to change this slide as I'm looking at it. It's 3F. It's fight, flight, or freeze. There's actually 3 responses in the human body. And those responses are really helpful when you are suddenly faced with something dangerous. They're helpful at the beginning, but long term, they cause trouble. So let's start off with this little line at the bottom of your screen where it says autonomic arousal. Your autonomic system is the things that run on autopilot, autonomic. So your breathing, your heart rate, your blood pressure, those are things you can't control that your body just controls on its own. They're automatic. So autonomic system. Your normal autonomic arousal state is hopefully pretty low-key. Low blood pressure, low heart rate, you're not breathing too fast. So that's what that line down there represents. When you are faced with a danger, there's some kind of trauma experience, your body perceives that as, uh-oh, danger, danger, better get ready to escape this and survive. All of those autonomic responses are going to go up. Your heart rate is going to increase. Your breathing is going to increase. Your blood pressure is going to go up. Your body is getting prepared to fight, to fly, to run away, or to freeze. When that event is over with, when you are safely past it, for most of us, our body's responses then go back down to our normal resting state. That's how things are supposed to work. And then you're off on your merry way. What happens when somebody has post-traumatic stress disorder is a physical response in your body. I think that people really underestimate. In our culture, we think that everybody's stuff is in their head, when a lot of it is physical responses in your body. What happens with post-traumatic stress disorder is that people essentially get stuck in this autonomic arousal response. They are stuck in expectation of danger. They are ready to survive. So their heart rate is out of sync, their blood pressure is out of sync, and they may not necessarily be high, but they are out of sync with each other. So it's it's like that response has become scrambled, and it doesn't know how to go up when it needs to and back down when it needs to and stay low. You're just always expecting danger. And in fact, in hospital emergency rooms, if they look at what are those autonomic nervous system responses, you can predict who's going to walk away with PTSD from an event and who's not. The people who are in the hospital after a traumatic event and all of those systems are in sync with each other. Maybe they're going a mile a minute, but they're all working together. That person will probably be okay. It's the person where it's just become completely deregulated. One system is doing one thing, another system is doing another thing. It's like their brain has forgotten for a while how to function and how to coordinate itself. Your brain stem, because that's clear down here, the most ancient part of your brain. That part has become uncoordinated. And those are the folks that, again, end up with PTSD. What that looks like in terms of symptoms, and when you hear me pause, that's because I can't multitask like I used to in my youth. So what I'm seeing from Sherry is this note that paradoxically these modes are a life-sustaining mechanism. Again, all of these things are in our bodies to protect us at that moment of crisis, and they are the things that keep us alive. They are instinctual. They're part of our basic animal response to danger, and then sometimes they get stuck. And what it looks like when they get stuck is, not surprisingly, hyper-arousal is one of the criteria, one of the traits of post-traumatic stress disorder. The person is constantly expecting danger. They may startle easily. They may be very irritable because they're startling and they're not sleeping. They are fidgety. They can't, that leaking faucet that's going drip, 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 they can't tune that out. It's making them crazy. They have a hard time relaxing, and they've lost that relaxed baseline that we all had. They're always looking for danger. What that might look like for you is, again, that fidgety client, the client where you go to reach for a piece of paper and they flinch, or you're talking to them and a car backfires in the alley beside your building. You didn't even hear it because you are completely you're completely unaware of that background noise anymore. And but they did. They hear it because they're really worried that it might be that perp's car, or they hear it as gunshot, you name it. Another category. Oops, there we go. So for a second my thing wasn't working, but I got it to work. Another category of symptoms is that this event continues to intrude on their life. They can't escape it. They can't escape it in their sleep because they have nightmares. They can't escape it in their waking state because they have flashbacks. They're in the grocery store and they're paying at the register, and suddenly the clerk's cologne, it smells like what their perp smelled like, and they're not even aware of it consciously, but their body remembers, and suddenly they start to shake and their heart starts to race and they're feeling panicky and they just drop everything and they run to the car and they sit there and they're sobbing and thinking, what's going on? I must be crazy. And even the grocery store is no longer a safe environment. So all those places that used to be a refuge aren't, and there's nowhere safe anymore to go. So they can't escape this event. Some interesting work done with World War II veterans. They looked at, they'd been interviewed when they first came back, right? And they got their stories of their experiences. So they're going back 30 years later and they're interviewing again. And what they find is the ones that, 30 years later have diagnosable PTSD still, when they tell their stories, their stories are almost exactly the same as they had reported 30 years earlier, 40 years earlier. When they talk to the people who don't have PTSD, their stories are kind of washed out. Like they remember what happened, but they don't remember the worst parts of it. And it's like before it was a technicolor image that they were describing, and now it's just kind of black and white outlines, kind of vague, and they have managed to put what happened behind them. The ones with PTSD, it is as vivid today as the day it happened. It is still with them. It's indelible. They can't get rid of it. The third cluster of post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms is called constriction. And if you think about trying to live in this hyper state and not being able to escape, then this other thing happens where basically you try and escape in other ways. So people might find themselves having altered states of consciousness, in other words, dissociating. They might become completely detached from their emotions, and they'll very calmly, it's like they're in shock, tell you about the most hideous things, and it's as though it happened to somebody else. There's just no emotion attached to it. Sometimes they even will describe it as though they were floating above their body or watching it happen to somebody else. Their time sense might be distorted. If you have ever been in a car accident where you knew it was about to happen and you couldn't avoid it, and it seemed like everything slowed down and was in slow motion, and there's that car sliding into you, then you have some idea of what that distorted time sense might feel like. When your body speeds up, you, as in when you are in crisis, you actually experience time differently. And as I said before, if you can't avoid and escape this in kind of natural biological ways like dissociation, there's lots of different other forms of escape that, like narcotics, that people will use to constrict the experience and be able to survive the trauma that they're continuing to live with. So what we find with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is that autonomic nervous system is completely disrupted, and that the immune system will even often turn around and attack the body. People that have had extensive sexual abuse histories in childhood often have higher rates of like uterine cancer, breast cancer, higher rates of autoimmune disorders. It's as if, you know, the body is trying to protect itself, but instead of attacking that external invader, it turns around and attacks itself. Some of the therapies that have been shown to be most useful for post-traumatic stress disorder are often things that are about regulating that autonomic nervous system again. They're about physical calming therapies. They talk directly to the brainstem. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, is a therapy that has shown a lot of progress. I don't know how somebody invented this, and I need to spend some more time studying how they're trying to explain how it works. What it looks like from the outside would be for me to say to you, okay, I'm going to hold this pencil up in front of your face, and I'm going to slowly move it back and forth, and I want you to follow it closely with your eyes. And you don't have to say anything, but what I want you to imagine, to picture in your mind is this traumatic event while you follow this with your eyes. And in doing that, the people are able to reprocess what happened and walk away experiencing less trauma symptoms. Another thing is yoga. Yoga is, again, all about calming and connecting to your body. And just see some of the other things there: acupuncture, tai chi, things that are about movement, theater, art, dance. Somatic therapies, again, body-based therapies have all shown a lot of promise with post-traumatic stress disorder. And what you'll see there is that they are not based on talking. Talking therapy certainly is helpful, but body work seems to show a whole lot of progress with PTSD. If it's about your body being out of sync, then we've got to resync your body. Some of the more controversial PTSD treatments, somatic therapies, there's work on kind of along this lines where it seems like performing the actions that would have overcome the sense of helplessness at the time, doing those and having it work this time seems to help. One of the key traits of PTSD is that sense of helplessness. This was happening to me. I couldn't avoid it. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't stop it. So if, for example, somebody was sexually assaulted in a somatic therapy session, what they might do is the therapist would like push against them, and they would be able to push that person off. Obviously, you don't want somebody who has not had extensive training. As I said, this is kind of on the edge of what they're looking at now experimentally to see how hopeful it is. You know, I'm actually last time when I was traumatized, it didn't work. This time I am successfully able to push you off me. I no longer feel helpless. My body has discharged that energy that didn't work last time. This time it does, and I'm able to get past it. So that's some of the kind of what's going on in the field of treatment. And again, it's about the body. You know what you know, and you know what you feel based on your body state. But when your body betrays you, when your body is constantly aroused and you can't trust it to tell you if there's something dangerous, you can't trust it to tell you, am I supposed to be mad now because my blood temperature, my blood pressure's up? When you can't trust it anymore, traumatized people learn to ignore their body. It isn't trustworthy. I can't depend on it. I'm going to ignore it. They may not be able to feel injuries. They may not be able to feel and be in contact with their emotions because their body has betrayed them. So it's helpful to give people back their body. So not only ask questions about what happened, but ask questions about how does their body feel when they're telling you that. That's a very simple counseling technique. Or even noting something. You know, when you're talking to me about that event, I can see that your hands are clenched. I'm wondering if you feel angry. When you're talking to me, I'm noticing that your knee is bouncing, or your foot's wiggling, or whatever. And are you feeling uncomfortable or nervous? You're just bringing them back in contact with their body. Back to that safety net, though, we have to spend at least as much time working on what helps the person to feel safe and strong and not helpless as we do working on, the what happened to you questions. In fact, if I only had 3 questions that I could ask a client, I would focus more on what makes you feel better, what has worked in the past for you, what is safe for you, than I would on, gee, tell me what happened to you. Because the past never gets any better. Reliving the trauma by talking to me about it is only going to help so much. And if I have to spend my time focusing on something, I want to focus on what's going to make them stronger to move forward into the future. What's going to help regulate their system, what's going to help them to maintain or rebuild their self-capacity. What is going to calm them? We naturally try to calm down and reorganize when we experience trauma. We try to go home, even when home is dangerous. If you take a mouse, an animal, in its normal state, we are primed instinctively to be very curious and to explore the new. That's our normal resting state. Get out there, explore things, find out, find the food, see what's in the world. When we're in an aroused state, when we're in crisis, when we're scared, we have the opposite natural inclination, which is go home. Go to where it's safe. Go to what you know. Avoid new stimulus. Avoid new stimulus. You're already hyper alert, so avoid new stimulus. So it's no wonder that even when home is no longer safe, it is familiar. And that's what people seek when they're in crisis. I can't stand one more new thing. I can't stand one more new stimulus. I am overwhelmed. At least I know what to expect at home. And whether that's a mouse or whether that is one of our clients who is feeling completely overwhelmed and going back to an unsafe situation, at least it's not one more new thing to try and cope with when they're at their limit. Another thing that you see in trauma is that people bond and people naturally go to those calming experiences. Think about any news footage you have seen of a natural disaster. And I can guarantee you that if they show kind of the crowd standing around, I'm sure if they showed crowd pictures of what's going on right now with the mine collapse in Virginia, what you would see is groups of people standing around, hugging each other. Groups of strangers standing around, hugging each other, patting each other on the back, crying together. And that's our normal primate reaction to trauma. And Sherry, I just sent out to you, added, it's a good idea to teach client techniques to assist, like, for example, counting down, calming, relaxation techniques, things to regulate their breathing, tapping, and also grounding techniques, not only calming techniques that will help them to, what do I want? What do I want to say? On the one hand, some techniques like guided visualization might be helpful, but if your problem is that they are not in contact with their body and they're leaving their body, then instead of that kind of thing, what you want to teach them is grounding techniques that will help them stay in their body, like tapping on their body, like gripping the chair, anything that will allow them to stay present and physical right now with you. Reminding them of what day it is, that they are here currently with you. It's today, it's this time, they are present, they are safe right now. How many bricks are in the wall, how many colors are in the room, anything that allows them to be here and now. Some more hospital room work. What they found is that if they can bring in safe loved ones for people after a disaster, the presence of those people, again, holding them, rocking them, patting them, that calms the autonomic system and allows them to regulate, just like it does for a baby. When you're holding a newborn baby, they can't regulate anything. They can't regulate eating or pooping. They can't calm themselves. And what do? We pick them up and we rock them and we pat them. And the rate at which people rock and pat babies is universal in every culture, everywhere in the world. And that's because that tempo, like that, at which you pat a baby, is the tempo of the resting human heart rate. So we physically regulate their autonomic nervous system. And so when people can do that in an emergency room, they can walk away with less chance of PTSD. Okay, I got to start talking faster. Let's move on to Battered Women's Syndrome, which is associated with PTSD. There is no mental health diagnosis of Battered Women's Syndrome. It is discussed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, which is the Mental Health Bible. It is discussed there under post-traumatic stress disorder, but it is not a mental health diagnosis in and of itself. Lenore Walker actually developed that term in the 80s from interviews that she was doing with battered women, heterosexual battered women living in shelters. That was her population that she was interviewing. And she kept seeing a cluster of symptoms. She said, these women all have post-traumatic stress disorder. They all have lowered self-esteem. And to both of those, I would say, yeah, duh. That's kind of the point of the battering. They all had self-destructive coping responses. In other words, drinking, cutting, dropping the restraining order, doing all kinds of unsafe behaviors. And she said they all have learned helplessness. And by learned helplessness, that phrase refers to research that was done actually originally on puppies, where they took puppies and they put them in a small room that had an electrified floor. And wherever the puppies went in the room, they would get randomly shocked. And what would eventually happen is that the puppies would just, sit in the corner and shake. And if they had an area of the room that they masked off, and if the puppies would just go to that place, the puppies would be safe. What they found is that the puppies wouldn't go there. And so this idea was coined that, well, the puppies had learned to be helpless, and so even if they could save themselves, they won't anymore because of what they've experienced. And so she was applying that to what she was seeing in battered women, that these women no longer try to escape, they return to the batter, et cetera, et cetera. They've learned to be helpless. So she was doing that research in like 79, 80. Later on in the 80s, Ed Gondolf looked at that same idea, and what he said is, you know what? It's not that they have learned helplessness. What they have learned is that there is no help, and that's a different matter entirely. In other words, they've tried running away, and that didn't work. They tried fighting back, and that didn't work. They tried asking other people for help, and that didn't work. And so eventually what they have learned is, if I'm going to survive this, the strategy that works for me is to hold still and wait out the beating. And that in doing that, they are applying a strategy just like any other strategy. It takes just as much courage, it takes just as much skill, it is just as much a valid strategy for survival as any of those other options. It only looks like learned helplessness from the outside, but it is a choice, courageous, strong strategy. So he reframed that. The term battered women's syndrome is actually more often a matter in the courtroom. And there is a myth out there that if a woman shoots her partner, all she has to do is claim, oh, I have battered women's syndrome, and that'll be self-defense, and she'll get off, and it'll be no problem. And there are tons of women sitting in prison who claim battered women's syndrome, and they are sitting in prison. Because even if you bring this in as an element of your defense to say, this contributed to this crime, you still have to prove every single other element of self-defense, just like anybody else. And that is extremely hard for survivors of domestic violence. But that's what battered women's syndrome is. I don't use it very often. When I'm asked to testify in court, they often say, we want you to come and talk about battered women's syndrome. To me, that makes it sound like battered women are crazy. And I'd much rather talk about what any reasonable person would do in this kind of situation. It is reasonable for any of us to have these responses. It's reasonable for us to have experienced trauma and to look like this afterwards. So I'd rather frame it as a reasonable, instinctive human response than to frame it in a way that makes it sound like, oh, battered women are all crazy. Another thing that we need to talk about that goes part and parcel with this whole issue is Stockholm Syndrome. When I started talking about Stockholm Syndrome 15, 20 years ago, nobody had ever heard of it. And now it's been a lot more upfront in the news, which I appreciate because that means I don't have to yell at my TV screen so much anymore. So the situation started off with this hostage situation in Stockholm, Sweden. These two ex-convicts go in. They take these bank employees hostage. They keep them there for a couple days. And afterwards, when the whole situation is resolved, and the media is sticking their microphones in the hostages' faces and saying, well, how did you feel about that? The hostages are saying, well, you know, they aren't bad guys. They treated us pretty well. I hope that the courts are merciful. We're concerned for them. We're worried. And two of the hostages become engaged to them. One actually does end up marrying one of these guys while they're awaiting trial. And some social scientists looked at that and said, what is that about? Studied it, and what they ended up finding they called Stockholm Syndrome. And what they said is, in a situation where these four things are happening, where the level of threat is lethal, I could kill you if I wanted to. I have the ability to kill you, and if you don't do what I want you to do, I will kill you. So very high level of threat. When that victim can't escape, so that staying alive absolutely depends on that perp. That perp has the power of life and death over them, and so far that certainly can apply to many of our clients. Particularly when they have reached the point where they are concerned that their partner has the capacity to kill them, then suddenly they are terrified in a way they've never been scared before. They've tried to escape in various ways. They can't. The batterer drags them back. There are barriers, whether that's children or housing or anything else. They are unable to safely be away from that batterer. Third thing that has to be there for Stockholm Syndrome is isolation. Well, gee, that's part of the power and control wheel. When I am trapped with you and you tell me it's raining outside, and I look outside and I see sunshine, you know what? That's irrelevant. My answer is, oh my gosh, you're right, look, it's raining. Because the only reality that matters at that point is yours. My reality is meaningless. Whether it's raining or not raining is completely irrelevant. All that matters is that you think it's raining. And if I'm going to survive this situation, my best bet is to get so far inside of your head and understand you so thoroughly that I can predict what you're going to want me to do. I can anticipate your demands. I can jump before you even say jump. If I can get you on my side, make you believe that I support you, I'm on your side, I am not a threat to you, you may allow me to live. That's not done consciously. It's not like the person is sitting there strategizing, oh, if I do all these things, I'll survive this event. They are very ancient, instinctive responses to this kind of trauma, to this kind of captivity. You can have all those three things that I've mentioned so far, isolation, can't escape, and the threat to kill, and you will not have Stockholm Syndrome without the fourth piece. And that is the key that makes it all happen. And that is the kindness. That really describes what happens with the cycle of violence pattern in a number of domestic abuse relationships, where the source of the fear and the terror is also the only source of support, the source of getting your needs met. I mean, the person that just beat me up and wiped the floor with me is also the person present in that home who then picks me up, pats me, and says, I'm so sorry you made me do that to you. Here, let me help you to bed. Let me get you a cup of tea. Sends me flowers in the morning. Stockholm Syndrome fits what happens in domestic violence so well. It's not surprising that so many of victims end up with it. Stockholm Syndrome can happen. There's no there's no age limit. It can happen to anybody regardless of gender, age, ethnicity, cultural background, and length of time is pretty irrelevant. In other words, in 45 minutes, Stockholm Syndrome can develop, so long as you have those 4 key conditions. There was a situation in Washington, D.C., this was long before 9/11, where these guys went into a federal building and essentially took a secretarial pool hostage. And they had most of the folks in one room. They had the threat to kill. You know, you do what we say or we'll kill you. They couldn't escape, and they were isolated. They were all locked in this little room together. So they had those 3 conditions. But they took one woman out, and they took her to another room, and they had her be the go-between. So she was the one that had to be on the phone and talk to the outsiders and, you know, tell the police what their demands were, etc. And, of course, when you've got a gun in your face, you're going to wig out. So for her, in order to calm her down and get her to do that for him, for them, there was more than one of them, she got the kindness piece. She got the, don't worry, we're not going to hurt you. We just want you to you know, speak on the phone for us. We just want you to be our mouth. So she got all 4. And when they did interviews with, and this whole thing was resolved in 45 minutes. When they did interviews with the people who were trapped in the room, and they said, well, you know, even describe these guys physically. They were smelly, poorly dressed, nasty, awful, ugly young men. When they asked the woman who had been separated and who had the kindness as well, even just give a physical description. Nicely dressed, attractive, you know, good-looking, nice young men. So her entire experience had changed based on this 4th piece. And again, she was concerned about what was going to happen to them after their arrest. In order to survive, I need to bond with my perpetrator. I need to make my perpetrator believe that I am on their side. I need to assume my perpetrator's worldview. And that's exactly what happens. Okay? So I'm now living inside my perp's head, not inside my own anymore. My own has disappeared. My own needs, my own feelings are gone. And, you know, my heart is racing. I'm feeling butterflies in my tummy, and I should be afraid, but at the same time, I'm complying with what you want. I'm trying to please you. You know, when's the last time I was trying to please somebody and I had butterflies in my tummy and my heart was racing? It must be love. They're trying to explain their own behavior to themselves, and the more severe the terror, the more likely it is that they are going to explain it to themselves as, I must love this person. On the face of it, it doesn't seem to make sense, but once you dig down and you think about it in terms of survival, oh yeah, it does, because it does these things for them. First of all, it allows you to calm down. If you are just wigging out and you are just freaking, you're likely just to be shot because you're annoying. If you can calm down, you can think more rationally, you can predict, you're more likely to survive. So Stockholm Syndrome allows you to not become overwhelmed by your terror and to survive. And Sherry adds quite accurately that you won't survive a situation if you don't believe that you can. And so what Stockholm Syndrome does is it gives you hope. It allows you to think, okay, I got through this, tomorrow's going to be better. For somebody who's being battered, if I comply with the rules tomorrow, this won't happen. If I just do this and this, then they'll love me, they'll forgive me, they'll allow me to survive. Hope, what Stockholm Syndrome is hope. This person, if I love them enough, they'll change. It allows that abuser to bond with me, and truly, then the abuser is less likely to kill me. If it gives me hope, if it gives me a sense of control over my situation, I can endure better. Again, it relieves that sense of helplessness that is so tied to post-traumatic stress disorder. And even if it's a false hope, even if it's a false sense of control, it allows me to endure, it allows me to adapt, and to come out the other end alive. What it looks like in practice, what you see in people, what you hear in people, is some basic cognitive distortions. In other words, they're thinking differently. They are absolutely focused on here and now rather than the future. The future is irrelevant. I need to get past today. I need to get through today. So the client that goes and drops the restraining order, you've warned them, you've said, you've already dropped these twice. If you drop this one, the judge is never going to want to look at you in the face again. And she says, it doesn't matter. If I can't worry about the future. I have to get through today. I have to drop this today, or I'm going to die. They may not see themselves as abused. Again, if they're thinking from their abuser's perspective, their abuser doesn't think they're doing anything wrong. And so they're likely to see themselves as the problem and not the abuser as the problem, because that's what the abuser thinks. So they won't see themselves as abused. They will see their abuser as a victim. This poor person, they're under stress at work. This poor person, they had a bad childhood. This poor person, well, they have a drinking problem. It's not their fault. And whatever excuses their abuser uses, they will take on as their own worldview. They see their abusers as majorly powerful. When you have somebody who says, if I even, my abuser's going to know that I was even here today, that I talked to you, I can't call the police because they are all friends of my batterer. And in lots of IO communities, that may be true. It may not be paranoia. It may be true. But their abuser is all-knowing, all-powerful, and inescapable, because their abuser has convinced them of that fact. They can talk about their abuser's feelings. They can talk about their abuser's dreams. They can talk about what their abuser needs. And when you say, yes, but what do you want? What do you feel? They don't know. They have completely lost touch with that. If I just love them enough, they'll stop. You hear that all the time. So even though you may not see full-blown Stockholm Syndrome in all of your clients, this list of traits here is really, really common in survivors. And I think that a lot of survivors have at least a touch of Stockholm Syndrome, because these kinds of ways of thinking are just everywhere in the folks that we work with. So what's this going to mean as far as the work you do? If you are talking to somebody with Stockholm Syndrome, how are you going to approach them? What kinds of things are you going to do with them or say with them? How is that going to impact your interactions? Time for some hands or some flying fingers. I'm happy to unmute people if you want to speak, if your fingers won't type fast enough for you. I'm still a hunt and pecker myself. And I'll give myself a chance to take a drink and you guys a chance to respond. Well, I have some ideas, obviously, about what it might mean. And one thing I guess that I just want to highlight is that you probably know there's no point in arguing with a drunk. And I think there's no point in arguing with Stockholm Syndrome. In other words, if you tell somebody, well, you should be scared, or you shouldn't be with this person anymore, all of those things that you've already been trained not to say. One of the reasons you've been trained not to say that is because it's arguing with Stockholm Syndrome, and that person will shut you down and shut you out and walk away and leave your program again. They don't want to hear that. That is too threatening. And so it works much better to meet people where they're at and to say, okay, tell me what you love about your partner. Tell me about the good times. Tell me how you met. Tell me what still attracts you. And be a safe place to talk about all the good stuff. And rather than saying, you shouldn't be with this person, say, I'm scared for you. Here's why I am scared. These are the danger signs I see that make me scared for you. I'm not saying that you can't be with this person, but let's see if we can figure out ways that it would be safer so that you can stay with this person. I think all of us still in our guts want every battered person to leave that relationship and be safe and happy and live happily ever after and be empowered. The reality is many of them won't. We know that. And many of them can't. So instead, to be a safe place to talk about the good stuff and to talk about, rather than leave this person, safer ways to be with that person, such as if your partner is arrested, they have to go to the Battered's Education Program, and that may be a place where they learn some different relationship skills. If they're accountable for the violence, they may at least stop using the violence. Let's do some safety planning and figure out safe places in the house, safe ways to get out of the house, and how you can ask for help in a crisis. You're a safe place to talk, and you're breaking isolation. If we look at those, again, those factors that lead into Stockholm Syndrome, and how can we, I'm going to backtrack here. Oh, they're farther back than I thought. If we can break isolation, then we're whittling away at the Stockholm Syndrome, and we're opening the door for other thoughts. If we help with the barriers so that they are able to escape, particularly those life risks, the child care, the housing, the job skills, we're chipping away at Stockholm Syndrome and allowing there to be room to once again have your own feelings, voice, wants, needs. But to just flat out argue with the person about whether or not they should be with someone doesn't work. And that's one of the reasons that you've been taught not to use those kind of skills, not to say, oh, well, you shouldn't be with this person. Okay, let's see. So Sherry's talking about having code words as part of a safety plan. Sometimes the only person that the client is allowed to call is not you, for sure. So they may have to pretend they're calling somebody else, and they may have to come up with code words. And that is their way of asking for help. So again, building those safety plans opens the door for them thinking, maybe things aren't good here. Maybe it isn't love I'm feeling. It helps to reconnect by breaking the isolation and by making it safer for them to stay. Okay. Boy, it's going to be hard for me to talk. I'm kind of looking through this myself, talk about some of this stuff without doing it in person. And I'm also getting short on time. But it's important enough. I'm going to try and barrel through some of it at least before we move on and talk about mental illness in general and substance abuse. I want to talk about how trauma impacts memory, because this is another thing that you're going to see in all of your clients. The way your normal, everyday memories are stored is words. Memories are stored verbally. They're stored as stories. The reason that you can't remember things from when you were very, very small, or can't remember them very clearly, is that you had not developed the verbal skills yet to store the memory in your head and to find it. Once you have the words and you can tell a story about it, as you get older and develop those skills more, your memories become more and more and more clear. trauma is stored completely differently in your memory. Before you had words, you stored memory as pictures, as feelings, sensations on your skin, as smells, as sounds. And all of those sensations, that is that early pre-verbal pathway, that is how trauma is stored in your body, in your memories. So if you think about a question like, what did you have for breakfast? I can answer that real quickly in words. Well, I had a vanilla scone. Very easy. I don't want this to be a traumatic memory, but if you answer some question like, what did your grandfather smell like? To kind of simulate trying to recover a trauma memory, if I asked you to describe, what did your grandfather smell like? You probably go through a process to really reconnect. You probably even breathe in, take a deep breath through your nose. And when I do that, I can actually recreate the scent of my grandfather in my head. And it's ice glue aqua velva, cigarette smoke, engine oil. Later on in his life, it's vodka, but that special smell of vodka when it's been sweated out through the pores rather than how vodka smells in a bottle. Some very specific scents all mixed in there. And by doing that, I can re-experience the smell of him in my head. That's a much longer process, and I do almost have to physically breathe in and feel it in my nose, smell it in my nose again. So when somebody is remembering trauma, it's like they have to re-experience it in some small way. And then they have to find ways to describe what they are re-experiencing. That's a much longer process than just saying, well, I had vanilla scones for breakfast. Okay, if we cut your brain in half, the yellow part in this picture, that top part, your neocortex, underneath all of that are two parts of your brain that are very much involved in memory. I'm going to talk about a little bit. The hippocampus is that green thing. There's one part on each side. It's kind of vaguely horseshoe-shaped, hippo meaning horse. And sitting on top of it is your amygdala, two little almonds. So here is your hippocampus, and then your amygdala sits on top of it. Your amygdala, your almonds in your head, that's why you feel fear. If somebody's amygdala has been damaged, they no longer can feel fear. So it has two functions. Well, and of course I'm completely oversimplifying the human brain. Let's just say that from the start. But one of its primary functions is fear. And the other thing is to tell you what things mean emotionally. So for me, if I see a picture of my daughter, it is my amygdala that tells me, oh, love, right? And if I see a spider, it is my amygdala that gives me a little shriek because I'm terrified of spiders. It tells me what things mean emotionally. It is your amygdala that does the fight, flight, or fear. It raises your blood pressure, it increases your heartbeat, and it can do all of those things without you having to stop and think about it. The message comes into your eyes, it goes to your amygdala, and your amygdala says, run. All of those fight, flight, fear, that's handled in your amygdala. You don't have to stop and think, which means you can do them quicker, right? You don't have to figure out if this is dangerous or not. And your amygdala can learn what is dangerous in your environment. So a particular survivor may be keyed to a certain look, a certain action, and that triggers the fight, flight, fear response in them, where for somebody else, that wouldn't be triggered at all because their amygdala hasn't learned that that's a danger signal. The hippocampus, think of that as your brain secretary. That horseshoe shape, it categorizes and stores memory up in that spongy neocortex, the big stuff on top. So it will take that picture of the spider that I mentioned earlier. My amygdala says, ooh, scary. And my secretary says, okay, I'm going to store that over here with the other things that Kirsten is afraid of. Spiders, scorpions, millipedes, and centipedes. I have a 6-leg limit. Anything with more than 6 legs is frightening. Anything with 6 legs or less, I'm okay with. No problem. The picture of my daughter, okay, that's going to be stored over here with the memories of her children. Da-da-da-da-da. And then if you were to talk to me and say, Kirsten, what are you afraid of? You're talking to my brain secretary. You're talking to my hippocampus. And it's going to go and it's going to pull open that drawer and it's going to pull out the events and experiences of things with more than 6 legs and tell you about what I'm afraid of. You're talking to my hippocampus. Another thing your hippocampus does is that's where short-term memory takes place. So when you look up the phone number, you're going to order a pizza. You look it up in the phone book. You call. You order your pizza. You hang up. And 2 seconds later, as you're setting the phone down, you think, damn, I needed to order pop too. And you have to go and look up the number again. You held that number in your hippocampus only as long as you needed it. And then, since you didn't need it after that, you let it go. You didn't store it. And Sherry notes that this is a serious issue for clients that are using meth, as it also affects the senses. Absolutely. Any meth and various other drugs affect the way your brain processes sensory information, the way it's storing sensory information. It triggers most drugs. One of the reasons that we take them, including Haagen-Dazs, is that they stimulate pleasure centers in your brain. So all of that is going to impact memory. Now, if your hippocampus is damaged, obviously you're going to have trouble with memory. If you harm your brain secretary, it's not going to remember so well. It's going to have trouble storing stuff, and it's going to have trouble remembering where it put it. So you may have a memory somewhere there in your head, but you can't find it anymore. Alzheimer's hits the hippocampus. Now, when you think about it, if you've ever talked to somebody with Alzheimer's, you go in, you introduce yourself, you go in the next day, they've never heard of you before. Their brain wasn't able to sort and store the memory, or it's there, but it can't find it anymore. PTSD, and it's also sometimes like their secretary is just randomly throwing open drawers and accessing memories. Here's what happened in 72, and here's what happened in 68. So that's what happens with Alzheimer's in the hippocampus. And PTSD can act in a very similar way on that part of your brain. When they cut open the brains of people who've been diagnosed with PTSD, their hippocampus is smaller than average. The rest of the brain may be fine, but that particular organ has been eaten away. It can be up to 25% smaller. So what I'm suggesting is that trauma can cause brain damage, and that brain damage can be permanent, even if there's been no actual head injury. So let's make this even more confusing, and that is, you may be saying, yeah, but doesn't stress make it so you can remember an event better? And isn't that why we have the whole issue of excited utterance, that what people say at the time and their first reports of what happened at a crime are considered to be more credible because it's fresh in their memory, it just happened, they don't have time to think of a lie, and it's all new and fresh. Well, yeah, that's true up to a point. You will probably always remember where you were on 9/11. And the reason that's true is that adrenaline, just like it affects your heart rate and everything else, it affects your brain. It makes your amygdala work faster. Your amygdala becomes hyperactive. It is taking in information and assigning meaning to it, doing the fear response faster and better than it would without those kinds of chemical rushes. But long term, so short term, great, sharp memory. But long term, what happens is that those same hormones will damage your body. Sherry's adding it's the concept of flashbulb memory. Yes, you will have very vivid flashes of memory, but particularly if somebody's trauma over time, and for example, if they've been battered, what happens is that stress hormones in your body, we can just deal with adrenaline because that's the one that people are most familiar with. When your body's done using it, it breaks down into other substances, and those substances are toxic. This is one of the reasons where after a crisis you might have to pee a lot because your body is trying to flush toxins from your body, the toxic byproducts once it's used the adrenaline. This is one reason why you want to cry. The chemical makeup in your tears when you get a bug in your eye is different than the chemical makeup in your tears right after a crisis. Your body uses peeing and crying to eliminate those toxins because otherwise they damage heart tissue, they damage brain tissue, they're not good for you. People can become very dehydrated after a trauma event. So get them to drink water and get them to flush those toxins out because it actually physically damages your body. And that's going to make you more forgetful. Now at this point in a live action, everybody here training, I would be doing this fabulous M&M exercise. I hope you get to see it sometime. I'm going to pass it by. That would make all of that very clear about how trauma can impact your memory. But just imagine if your secretary has been overwhelmed, it can't process as fast, it's got a memory in there, but it can't find it anymore. And if memory is being stored as pictures, sounds, smells, rather than as a story, and you're asking somebody to tell you what happened, and they have to go through this multi-stage process of re-experiencing it and then trying to somehow turn that picture or that smell or that just that feeling in my body of motion or that feeling on my skin into some kind of a word so that you understand what happened to me. Another part of your brain I want to talk about in trauma is called Broca's area, and that is for most of us, it's on the left side above your ear. And don't bother feeling it because you can't feel the bump from the outside. But it is a bump in there in your head that controls the motor movements you need to speak. So your tongue, your vocal cords, the motor movements necessary to produce speech. Part of fight, flight, remember, is freeze, and part of freezing is shut up. When you see the deer or the rabbit or whatever that just freeze and they try and be as quiet as possible so the predator will pass by, being quiet is part of freezing. And so it's not surprising that one of the things that often will happen in a traumatic event is that we can no longer speak. Our brain shuts that off. And so what you'll hear people say is, I couldn't say anything. I wanted to shout. I wanted to ask for help, but nothing would come out. And it's a really freaky experience. If you haven't experienced it, someday you probably will. It's just really odd. I have experienced it, and it's almost like there was a marquee across my forehead where I could see the words in my head, but nothing was coming out. And so that's where people talk about wordless terror, silent screams. Think about what that means for a defense attorney. You've got a client that's on the witness stand, and they were saying that this assault happened to them. And the defense attorney says, "Now wait a minute. You're trying to tell me that you were in this dorm room, and there was a party going on outside in the dorm, and there were people in the rooms all around you. You were surrounded by friends, and this person was assaulting you, and you didn't scream?" And the person says, "No." "Well, did you say no, that you didn't want this to happen?" And "No." "Well, why not?" And they say, "I don't know." And they don't know. They don't understand what happened to them. That is a defense attorney's dream. And yet it's a natural response in our bodies to freeze and to not be able to produce speech, to stay quiet until the predator is gone so it won't be eaten, essentially. So that's another weird thing that trauma does to us. And that can kind of be re-experienced when people are trying to tell you about their trauma. In other words, the closer they come to the worst part of the event, the harder it becomes to actually speak. And that's yet another reason, I think, why some of these physical forms of therapy have proved to be so helpful for post-traumatic stress disorders, because they don't rely on speech. If it's too hard for you to tell me what happened, don't worry, you don't have to. We can do these physical actions, and you will find a reduction in your trauma symptoms, even if you haven't told your story. One more thing I want to say, and then I really do have to move on, is about state-dependent learning. And that is that what you learn during one set of brain chemistry, you will learn better when you're experiencing that same chemistry. And as far as your brain is concerned, an emotional state is a chemical state. So what you learn when you are angry, you remember better next time you're angry. What you learn when you're sad, you remember better next time you're sad. This is why people brood. When you are in a sad, depressed state, suddenly you can remember all the shitty things that ever happened to you in your whole life, and you brood. When you're in a happy state, you have better access to your happy memories. This is also why if you are studying for a test and you are staying up all night and you are hopped up on caffeine, and then you allow yourself to sleep for 4 hours and you try and go take that test, and you don't do well, then you go home, you drink a cup of coffee, and you can remember everything, you better drink that coffee and put your brain back into that same caffeinated state as you were studying in, and you'll actually do better. The same thing applies to beer. If you're studying while you're drunk, you will actually do better on your test if you drink a beer before the test and put your brain back into the same chemical state. I would never recommend drinking while you're studying, but nevertheless, drink a beer before your test and you'll do better. Okay. So away from the violence during honeymoon periods, if you're being battered, you may not have full awareness, full access to the memories of the fear and the danger that you would have, that you have when that next battering event is starting to happen. Because you can't live long term in constant terror and fear, and so your brain doesn't let you remember them as well. But as soon as you're back in that same chemical state, boom, there it is. I always say that this is the reason why there are second and third and fourth children in the world. Because once you've gone through childbirth and you've had a child, if you could actually remember what you experienced during that labor all the time, and you had full access to those memories, you wouldn't do it again. You don't actually remember what happened to you until you're in labor, then the second time with the second child. And then suddenly, boom, you're back in that place, and you know what's coming, and you're like, get me out of here. I'm not going to do this. I want all this right now. And, of course, it's too late. Oh, Sherry says, I'm telling my boss he told me to drink beer before sessions to do a good job. Yes, provided that you studied while drunk. If you studied how to do counseling while drunk, you'll do better in your sessions if you have a beer beforehand, which is why I would never recommend studying while drunk. Nevertheless, it is a truism. So how to help your traumatized clients? Remember that their stories are always going to change over time. They're going to remember them differently based on what emotional state they're in. They're going to remember them differently based on how much of a safety net is under them, how much they are able to remember, how much they're able to cope with remembering versus how much they have to dissociate just to get through life. And so just accept that their stories are going to change over time. Sometimes that's because they can't keep the elements of the different assaults straight anymore. Sometimes it's because they're flat out lying to you. Sometimes it's because they're lying to themselves. Sometimes it's because they truly remember them different on different days. And just accept that that's normal, that you believe them, that it will impact their credibility in the courtroom, and to prepare them for that, and let them know that it's just a normal part of experiencing trauma. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. Are there any questions or comments specific to trauma?